WNST. Forward to this next conversation and daring to get back into chatting with musicians and people in the music industry after 30 years of doing sports radio here. I saw this guy show up on a Twitter feed about a month ago. I had never spoken to him, but I've seen him on TV, and I've actually seen him on Deepak Chopra on the internet. He is probably the most accomplished songwriter, and I remember the first time I bought a Kiss song back in 1979, 1980 that had his name on it, and then his name showed up on every Bon Jovi liner, and Alice Cooper, and Joan Jett, and on and on and on. And I'm just honored that he's decided to take part in this little project we're having here and talk about some old rock and roll. He is a songwriting Hall of Famer. He's doing all sorts of stuff. I don't know whether to call him a musician, a songwriter, a filmmaker. He's done all sorts of stuff and written more songs that you've heard of than you probably realize. And the next 20 minutes are going to be a real pleasure as we welcome in live from Nashville, Tennessee. And I should say the band leader of the band Rouge many, many years ago, and talking all sorts of things, including his autobiography that's coming out later on with a song that you've probably heard of called Living on a Prayer. Big songs for big life. It's a pleasure to welcome Desmond Child onto the program to do nothing but tell old stories. Desmond, welcome. How are you? I appreciate you making some time for us today in Baltimore.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be on your show. It's fantastic.
Well, I tell you what, I've had some fun researching you because my wife and I, once you agreed to do this, crazily enough, and I get all sorts of athletes on and whatnot, but it's always a thrill when somebody that's never heard of me so far away, and I throw a lifeline out and say, this person want to come on and talk some music, but the Bon Jovi thing brings you to my doorstep, right? Like, it's my childhood with Kiss and music you've written, but getting that first Slippery When Wet CD when I was a music critic in 1986 on the backside of Fahrenheit, and all that had gone on for him, and how it's led you to this point in your career, because I think of those Slippery When Wet sessions in Vancouver and those songs, and I didn't even realize that you had written Without Love, and that's one of my favorites that I want to talk to you about. But him going into the Hall of Fame, this is another sort of, and when I have pitching coaches on and their players go to the Hall of Fame, I know this is something you take great pride in at this point in your life, that these things have stood the test of time in this way.
Well, it was a wonderful experience. I went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction for Bon Jovi. It's just like, I don't know, it's like 10 days ago, whenever it was. I mean, seems like last night. And I went with my husband, Curtis, and our twin teenage sons, Roman and Nero. And John's their godfather. So it was such a wonderful thing to be included in the inner circle of Bon Jovi, because really they are family to me. And my heart was bursting with pride to see, the band, all of them, take the stage. And it was especially heartwarming to see Richie up on stage with John and to see them hug and stuff. And it was just like brought a tear to my eye.
I interviewed him on the Slippery Tour and then on New Jersey back in the day, and I've run into him at various points, and he's always been so kind and normal through all of this. And your background goes back to Kiss, and I know the stories of Studio 54 and your career as a musician back with Rouge and Maria Vidal. And through all of this for John Bon Jovi, through all the years of fame, through the graying of the hair, through the changing of the music, through a little bit of Nashville, which you've gone through via Miami and New York and L.A. and Europe and everywhere you've been in your career as well. But, he's trying to buy an NFL team, right? So, I mean, and I think of all the things that he's been through as well. But to carry this role of fame through the Dignity period, been very difficult to do, because there were nights, I think, in the 90s where he went into some arenas and the fans weren't there anymore and the industry's changed so much. But, at the end of all of this, he's still out making relevant music. He's playing in D.C. in 2 weeks, and my wife and I are making a big night. One of our first date nights was to go see John Bon Jovi. First night I told anybody I was going to marry my wife was at a John Bon Jovi concert, quite frankly. So, music like Living on a Prayer and Without Love and You Give Love a Bad Name, but to see it all these years later, that you all get a night, right, to go in and do this thing and come together, that the music still gets hit. There's teenagers at this show I'll see in 2 weeks with John Bon Jovi, right?
Well, you can go to any Bon Jovi concert and you see people of all ages. You see old people with white hair, and you see little tiny kids that are kind of, on their parents' shoulders. And when nobody leaves until they hear Living on a Prayer, that's why it's always last in the set list. It's the very last song. Then they turn up all the lights, and people are standing and screaming out the song. You can't even hear the band. It's imagine 50,000 people screaming Living on a Prayer. And the whoa, oh my God, it's most thrilling experience of my life.
When I think of that, I go to Springsteen shows. I'm a little bit of a Springsteen nut. I'm the guy that flies to Australia and New Zealand when he's playing shows there and whatnot. And I've known Nils for years. And when you see Born to Run and the lights go on, when you see that iconic song, and we have a word for it, and we equate it right on up with Francis Scott Key, right? It's called an anthem, right? And to write anthems, there's no way when you're sitting with these kids 5 hairstyles ago, right, and 30 years ago, that it would be so timeless. I'm sure you've written a lot of songs that you thought would be a hit, and you've written so many hits, but you don't sit down to write a hit, right? I mean, that's not the way it works.
No, that isn't the way it works, because if I tried to think of it that way, I would probably have not gotten anywhere. I'm a professional songwriter, and so I take my job very seriously. When I go into the sacred circle to co-write with anyone, whether they're a solo artist or a band, I'm there in the moment, in the now, drawing on all the things that we all put on the table. And because we're artists, we know how to do it. And so when you're writing something that isn't just a retread of something else or something like that, when you're writing something and from a fresh idea, then that will be responded to. People will know it, and people will feel it. And so I always write to help the artist I'm working with to bring out their spirit and to help their journey of their souls move forward. So whatever they're singing, whether it's a fun song or a sad song or a patriotic song, all of it is the way that an artist gets to express themselves and move their life forward. So that's how I think of it.
Well, you've been sought out for, by 3 generations of people in music and all sort of genre to co-write. How often have you sat in your life alone and written? I'm sure that's the first part of this in the early days is, I'm a writer myself. I've written a couple of books. It's a very solitary experience, but there's a whole different thing, I would think, of walking in and collaborating with someone that has a vision, and you've been so good at being behind the scenes for all of these stars when this whole thing began with, I'm sure you wanted to be a star yourself early on, but then walking in and finding what makes the other person tick. I mean, do you ever write alone, or is it something that you enjoy the part of having someone to bounce that off of?
Well, I started out as a duo called Night Child with Virgil Knight, and so that's why we were Night Child, And so then that was in high school, and then when I got to college, I met Maria Vidal, and along with Diana Grasselli and Miriam Valley, we formed Desmond Child and Rouge. So I was pretty much solely writing all the songs and occasionally co-writing with Maria because she was my girlfriend at the time, and we lived together, and we rehearsed in the one room. It wasn't even didn't even have bedrooms. It just had a living room. And in fact, she was a waitress at singing restaurant. It was like a diner where the people sang in New York City, and her kind of like fake name was Gina Velvet, and that's where I got Gina for Living on a Prayer.
That was an incredibly creative period of time, right? I mean, I went back and watched, and I remember the Rouge song, but I hadn't listened to it it hadn't come in contact with me in 30 years. I'm of that era, and I remember the music. It was so disco-charged, right? And New York was such a melting pot, and the Miami part of that was also a part of disco that sort of began all this for you, right?
Well, yes. I mean, I grew up, listening to the music of Casey and the Sunshine Band on the one hand, and Laura Nyro on the other hand. And so somehow, when we got to New York, Maria and I decided to kind of put together a pop group that had all kinds of elements. It had Latin elements, it had rock elements, it had singer-songwriter elements, and doo-wop elements. We wanted to throw everything we loved into it, and I think that we were a little ahead of our times because a lot of the things that we were doing disco beats with rock guitars, that kind of blossomed later. And in fact, I convinced Paul Stanley that we should write a song with a disco beat, and that song was "I Was Made for Loving You."
And he, pushed that back. I watched some stuff on the internet earlier before I chatted with you about Studio 54, but there was a whole, like, Blondie and the Talking Heads and the New York Dolls and where Kiss came from with the makeup and that whole side of it. There was an incredible artistic thing happening in New York at that period of time. I mean, Paul Shaffer, you were connected to that as well. And
he was the pianist on our first album.
And everything that happened after that was Saturday Night Live and the comedy part of that all of these artists had gathered in New York and, Warhol, the whole deal that splintered into all of this 40 years later. And Bon Jovi was a kid at that point, right? So there was a whole next generation of all of this to come along. But it took people like you to write the songs, Desmond.
Well, John said that he had been walking in the Village because he was working, I think, at the Village Recorder, I think. And he was like kind of an assistant pushing a broom, and he saw one of our posters, and he said, like, "Who's that guy?" And I think he went to see us in Red Bank performing, and so he always kind of had kind of that impression in the back of his mind, and maybe the kind of music that we were making and all that might have instilled something in him. But when he was on tour with Kiss in Europe, they were opening for Kiss. He asked, Paul Stanley suggested he call me to co-write, and that was the key that opened the door. I owe Paul Stanley everything. Last week, I received the ASCAP Founders Award, and it was incredible because Paul Stanley introduced me, and it was so touching, all the things that he said. And also Alice Cooper surprised me by opening my sequence. He all of a sudden, boom, ladies and gentlemen, Alice Cooper, and he sings the song Poison that he and I wrote, and an album I produced called Trash. And I just couldn't believe it, and he sang it better than ever. I mean, he's timeless. And it was just so exciting. And so, the thing that I take a lot of pride in is kind of maybe more kind of working class mentality. It's like my bands are still working. The bands I co-wrote with still work.
Alice Cooper was here about 6 weeks ago playing at the Model Lyric, one of our partners at WNST. Desmond Child is our guest. If you just joined us, we're talking about music and the history of music. And, from Paul Stanley to Bon Jovi to Aerosmith and Alice Cooper and Joan Jett. And then there was the Ricky Martin period, right? And writing hit songs. And whether it's Living on a Prayer and I guess the language of the streets where, New York in the 70s and the 80s and all that, transcending the rock thing, a lot of bands never escape that. And Bon Jovi's a great example of that. We have the M3 Festival here with the old metalheads, and I'm an old Hammerjacks guy from Baltimore. It's kind of where I cut my teeth 30 years ago as well. But for the bands, to your point, that are still working and still going out on the road and doing it here at this point, and sort of, from grunge to the Ricky Martin era through where you are now in Nashville and country music and what all that's become, it's really amazing that songwriting has become this industry for people like you, because I don't know that it was there for individual people 40 or 50 years ago. And I know many of you in the industry have talked about where the industry's going and where the money's going. You talk so much about Kiss and Bon Jovi. They ran their businesses the right way. Other bands looked at Kiss as to the right way to run their business so they're not broke later on. And the industry is kind of struggling for money and struggling for an identity of how artists are going to make a living in the future, right?
Well, the thing about Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons and someone like John Bon Jovi is that they're genius businessmen. and they were never, ever, ever on drugs. And it was such a pleasure to walk into a room, and they came, on time, prepared, with ideas to throw on the table. That's a professional. And so, they ran their businesses that way. And so that's why they have money in the bank, big money, because they are smart, and they wanted to make sure that their entire lives was creative. Like Paul Stanley is a painter now, and he spends half of his time doing incredibly beautiful paintings that sell for huge amounts of money because he doesn't do anything that doesn't make money, and he's an accomplished painter, and I'm very, very, proud of him because I'm sort of like a closet painter as well, and would love to get back to it, sometime. And so Picasso always said, because he wrote poetry, and they said, well, why are you writing poems? You're the world's greatest painter. And he said, well, an artist has to be able to swim to different shores, and bring back new ideas. So by exploring, for me, different genres of music, there isn't a genre that I'm genre neutral.
But is part of it as you get older that you feel like you should be able to write better, that you would know more and have traveled more? Like I just pulled up the lyrics to "Without Love" from "Slippery When Wet" with Bon Jovi, one of my favorite songs. And there's a passage at the end. I see my life, some things I took for granted. Love's passed me by, so many second chances. I was afraid, I won't be afraid no more. Now, obviously, the "no more" part, that's not Shakespeare. It's a deep thought, certainly, but it's a deep thought of a guy that you must have been in your late 20s, 30s. John was all of 22 or 23, and Richie as well at that point. Do you think you write better stuff as you get older just because you see the world differently?
Well, everything is written. I write really simple, dumb songs now.
She bangs. You picked on that on the internet. You wrote the thong song for Cisco, so there's my Baltimore reference. Baltimore kid and Cisco had a huge hit,
with
right?
the thong song. Everything has to be appropriate to the artist you're working with. You can't write over their heads and over the heads of the audience that will be coming to see them or buy their music.
Well,
so there's a moment to be very, very artsy and deep, and there's a moment to just, have stuff where you just throw your fist in the air, and that's the beauty of music. It can be so many things, and recently I wrote a song on my own for Barbara Streisand, and I'm hoping she'll cut it.
Does she know about it or no? You just do it on your own and let her know about that part of it later.
No, it's a bit of wishful thinking, but I sent it and she likes it, but she hasn't said she's going to do it. But I've waited my whole life, to work with the greatest singer of all time, Barbara Streisand. It's a gay man's dream. It couldn't be better.
How does it work politically these days? Or are you the sought-out-y or the sought-outer? And obviously, Barbara didn't call you and say, write me a song, right? So, how does that work at this point?
I'm very friendly with her music supervisor, executive producer, Jay Landers. For many years, we know each other for decades. And she's making a special record. And so, so he reached out to me. And I think, I kind of reawakened his interest in me because I performed in New York a few months ago at Feinstein's 54 Below, my first solo show ever in my entire life. And
nervous?
At 54 Below. And I had never, ever done a complete show where I sing the entire show from top to bottom. And it was so exciting, and my collaborators and my bandmates from Desmond Child and Rouge came and sang 3 songs with me, and it was just really wonderful. And it's like, so Jay had found out about my show and came to one of the rehearsals, and his eyes opened, and then because I had played, we did a song from my Broadway show, Cuba Libre, that's in the process of being made, and I think it's more like something she would sing. And so he said, hey, write me a song for Barbara. And Jay is like an amazing, songwriter and lyricist himself. And I just sat down and buckled down and, just came up with something. And, everybody's liking it. So, it'd just be so awesome to produce Barbara Streisand. Just go in the studio. That's like, with the lion tamer with the biggest lion on earth, and no whip.
Desmond Child joining us here talking about all sorts of things, including you're putting together a memoir, right? And I guess all of these stories and all of the above, just in Googling you, and I thought I knew a little bit about you, and as I've sort of done the deeper dive into the fact that you wrote Livin' La Vida Loca, which I didn't realize, and also going back to the Rouge era and knowing that you had done this reunion thing, then I heard Beautiful Now, and I almost felt like I heard part of the same, that what's old is new again to some degree, because Beautiful Now probably could have played on the floor at Studio 54 40 years ago, probably, right? Wouldn't have been that far off, right?
No, not that far off, and, I co-wrote Beautiful Now with Antonina Armato and Tim James of Rock Mafia, and we came up with the song, and they presented it to Zed, who then jumped into the song, and then he brought in John Bellion and blah, blah, blah. But, basically, we wrote the song, the three of us, and Antonina's an incredible lyricist, and she wrote, like, one of my favorite bridges of all time, Let's Live Tonight Like Fireflies, that whole section.
Sure.
And Pass the Lamp. I mean, it's just like, it's so beautifully done and inspiring. And so Beautiful Now is, became a number one song all over the world, and it's actually my fifth decade of number one hits. Starting with Kiss, I Was Made for Loving You.
Desmond Child is our guest. It's been a real pleasure and honor to hang out with you for 20 minutes and just talk about your career. I appreciate you making some time for our music part of our programming here at WNST in Baltimore. And I got to tip the cap for your life and your lifestyle and the way you've lived your life and raised your kids. And you made a film a couple of years ago. Your boys were like maybe 11 at the time now, and 16 now, you said, and an ongoing story here, right? As is your life in Nashville and continuing to write songs.
Yeah, it'll be a never-ending story, because even when I pass on, my songs will live forever.
Living on a Prayer, the book will be called Big Songs, Big Life, co-written with David Rich. You'll be able to check that out, as well as the Broadway play and Cuba Libre and all the stuff. Desmond Child has a website at DesmondChild.com. He's on Twitter. He's cool. He writes great songs, and he made some time to join us here in Baltimore and talk about Bon Jovi and life. Desmond, thank you very much for the time. I hope to make your acquaintance, maybe at a Titans-Ravens game in Nashville sometime soon or something.
Yeah, that's where my sons are the jockiest jocks ever. I don't know how that happened.
Predators fever down there in Nashville, right? Appreciate you, Desmond. Take care. Desmond Child joining us here from Nashville, Tennessee. My goodness gracious. If you have not ever Googled the songs, Aerosmith, What It Takes, I Hate Myself for Loving You, Bon Jovi, Bad Medicine, Aerosmith, Angel, Dude Looks Like a Lady, Kiss, Heaven's on Fire, I Was Made for Loving You, all the way through Cher songs and Hanson songs and Weird and all sorts of stuff. Desmond Child, the man, the myth, the legend, Songwriting Hall of Famer, as well as ASCAP Hall of Famer recently with Paul Stanley of Kiss. Fun stuff. You can find me and that out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere you happen to be. Post-draft, hockey, baseball, all that good stuff. It's all chock full of goodness. And in our WNST morning newspaper, you get it 7 a.m. each and every morning. That's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life, guaranteed. Also, the Laurel entries about to become the Pimlico entries, also in the morning newspaper and on the front of our website as we get ready for the Preakness 2.5 weeks from now, and also the Derby running down in Louisville this week. We got a new quarterback here in Lamar Jackson. We're going to Louisville to talk about him. a little later on here. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore. And if you need me, Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports. Desmond, a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, I hope I gave you what you wanted.
Oh, my goodness. And oodles and spades. If I can ever help you in Baltimore, feel free to reach. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Maybe when my book comes out, we can do another talk about it.
I would be, I'd be thrilled. 6 months from now,
okay.
Christmas
time?
Yeah,
in about 6 months, something like that.
All right, well, do it the right way. Make it like Springsteen's.
Okay,
make me not want to put it down.
Bye.
See you soon. Cheers.